English at the Open University. I'll be chairing this session, so I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Tim Christaens, who is an assistant professor in philosophy at Tillburg University in the Netherlands. And he specialises in a number of areas which I think are very much at the heart of the seminar series, which is why I was particularly kind of keen to get him involved. He's done a lot of work in critical theory, particularly the work of Foucault, Agamben, Deleuze, and he's especially interested in seeing how the work of critical theory can be applied to, I guess, some of the most pressing problems in our current world, particularly around technology, digitalization, and the future of work. He's the author most recently of a book, which is called Digital Working Lives, Worker Autonomy and the Gig Economy, which you can see there, which is out with Roman and Littlefield in November. And the title of his talk tonight is Becoming Your Own Boss in the Gig Economy, a Story of Disappointment. So over to you, Tim.
Right, thank you for this introduction. I will start sharing, try to share my screen. Wait a second. Now you should be able to see my screen, but not the PowerPoint yet. Now it should be okay. Does everyone see the PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Then I'll start. So, welcome everyone. So as the title suggests, I'm going to talk about broken promises. And more specifically, if any one of you has ever worked in the gig economy or kind of looked up job advertisements from the gig economy, you will find advertisements like these one here from Uber, where it says, get paid weekly with Uber, earn your money on your schedule. So the claim is here that you can become an entrepreneur of your own one-man business by working with Uber. That's already an important thing. You don't work for Uber as an employee, but you work with Uber as an independent contractor. And so the claim is that you can, or at least the promise is that you can become independent and autonomous as a worker by working with companies like Uber or Deliveroo or Airbnb, Amazon Mechanical Turk, and by now there are quite a lot of these platform companies you can work with. And the claim is that you can become your own boss, because these platforms are specifically targeted to people who in the labor market don't have that many opportunities. And if they do, it's very often in a job where they lack all these forms of autonomy, don't get paid very well, and are subjugated to a boss. Think of, for instance, the classical job at McDonald's. At one point, for instance, Uber notified in one of its internal memos that one of its main competitors when it comes to finding workers is exactly McDonald's. So these are the kinds of jobs that, or the kinds of workers that Uber and these other companies try to attract. But once we look at the actual labor reality of working with these kinds of companies, this promise of autonomy doesn't really seem to hold on that well. It doesn't really seem to be realized as was promised. It seems that the pay is very low and the autonomy that was promised is not really delivered upon, because actually the boss has not disappeared at all, but has been automated. The boss is now an algorithm, namely in the case of Uber, for instance, the algorithm that determines who gets which ride and at what price. These are all things that these individual Uber drivers do not have a say on. This is all determined by the platform itself. And so what might seem as a promise of more autonomy, more independence, actually becomes dependence on very opaque systems of algorithmic control. And so that was kind of the main starting point of my book, Digital Working Lives. So as Edmund already mentioned, it came out a few months ago in November with Roman and Littlefield. But now for this talk, I'm going to work in 3 steps. I'm mainly going to focus here on step 3, because this is the one that for the, say, the critical citizen will be the most relevant part. First, I'm going to give a brief overview of the kind of philosophy I start from, which is a philosophy called post-workerism, which is a strand of Marxism that specifically focuses on the notion of worker autonomy. Secondly, I'm going to look at particular obstacles to worker autonomy in the gig economy. Now we're going to individualize some of those problems. And then 3, going to offer you my alternative and my response, which is what I call convivial autonomy. But so first up, post-workerism, what is that? So post-workerism, or as it was originally called, of course, workerism, comes from Italy. I'm not sure whether there are any Italians in the meeting right now, but in Italy it's called operaismo, which literally translates in English as workerism. And so it's a school of Marxism that came to prominence in the 1960s in Italy, mainly opposed to the official strategy of the communist the Communist Party at the time. And so the Communist Party in Italy in the 60s had a strategy that was very much based on the work of Antonio Gramsci, who used to be, as it were, the main party ideologue for the Communist Party. And what was remarkable about their strategy is the claim that to become powerful or to prepare for a communist revolution, the party needs to become hegemonic, which they interpreted as we need to infiltrate the official institutions of day-to-day politics, so parliament, government, etc. So the Communist Party in Italy was particularly well known for actually being a party of government. So particular cities or regions were actually governed by the Communist Party at the time. And the communists also tried to enter into a coalition government with the Christian Democrat Party, which was at that moment the main political party in Italy. It tried a couple of times, but each time it failed. But so that meant that the more the Communist Party tried to find compromises with, the political right or the political center, the more there were expanded a political vacuum to the left of the Communist Party. So among resistant or recalcitrant workers themselves, there was a sense in which the Communist Party was no longer representing their aspirations and their interests. And so there appeared then a new strand of Marxism that was much more focused on the direct action of workers on the factory floor. And so these were these workerists. And so they emphasized the spontaneous capacities of workers to organize themselves and to refuse the commandments of capital and to refuse labor, what they call in Italian rifiuto del lavoro. Mainly, to give a kind of an example of what they were thinking about. So these were activist researchers who went to the factories, interviewed individual factory workers, and then tried to figure out what forms of resistance they were already enacting, even if it seemed like the working class was completely integrated into kind of welfare state-based capitalism. Because they found forms of resistance, for instance, in absenteeism. Workers who claimed to be ill and stayed home, whereas in fact they were perfectly fine. So this was kind of an individual form of resistance that they already found. But they found even more than that. They also discovered that when workers, after their job, went out to a bar or something like that and talked to each other, that they would organize amongst each other how they would push down or decelerate the pace of work in the factory the next day. So they would do something that was at the time called autoriduzione, or self-organized reduction, where they would slow down the factory by, for instance, organizing individualized strikes. So rather than going on strike with all of them collectively together, they would go on strike as individuals. So basically it would mean that, for instance, I go on strike from 9 in the morning until 10, and then someone of you would go on strike from 10 to 11, etc., etc. And so by doing that, they would have disrupted the assembly line in the factory for an entire day without actually having to organize a full-blown strike. And so these workerists claimed, well, if workers are capable of those forms of self-organization already, then they can also organize the entire production process in the factories. So capital has, as it were, made itself redundant, and workers can organize at the factory floor on their own. So that was kind of the main thrust of the workerist philosophy. And so this philosophy morphed into what we now call post-workerism after contact with French critical thought. So lots of these Italian activist researchers at some moment had to flee Italy, and most of them went to Paris, where they were taken up by French philosophers at the time, like Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, and Félix Guattari. So if you want some names of these post-workerist thinkers nowadays, Antonio Negri is probably the most famous one. And apart from that, there are Paolo Virno, Maurizio Lazzarato, and Franco Berardi. Now you can see that this kind of post-workerist thought is very popular in research about the gig economy. So we see this idea of interviewing workers themselves directly and seeing what forms of resistance they are organizing in their day-to-day lives, that this is a very fruitful methodology for contemporary sociologists of labor. And so, for instance, in the UK, in interesting cases here, Callum Cant, a few years ago, he published a book called Writing for Deliveroo, where he documents his own experiences as a worker for Deliveroo in Brighton, and how he organized together with his colleagues one of the very first strikes of delivery couriers in the UK. And if you read the book, you'll notice that it's very influenced by this workerist and post-workerist thought. And another kind of interesting element here is that because these workerists were Marxists, that they give a kind of clear guidance on what kind of their normative alternative to the contemporary gig economy is. Namely, then they claim that workers should seize the means of production for themselves. And just like these workerists claimed, workers can organize the factory independently and autonomously. So capital is redundant. In the same way, people like Callum Cant claim, well, or Negri himself nowadays, claim, well, workers can expropriate these platform companies from their digital means of production and start organizing their own labor by owning their own digital platforms instead. And so that's what's at stake here. So this works as a kind of background. Now, let's see what are the obstacles to worker autonomy that we find. And in the book, I devote 3 chapters to this, and in each chapter, I look at one particular company. So the first one is exploitation. There I look at Uber. The next one is alienation. There's Airbnb. And then the third chapter is fatigue. And there I look at Deliveroo. But so let's start with exploitation. So probably, as you all know, the pay for these gig workers is quite low. But this in itself is not yet an argument that it's exploitative. It might just be that, that the added value or the contribution to society of these forms of work is relatively low, and hence why it's low paid. So saying that the pay is low is not enough to prove that it's exploitative as well. For that, we need a bit more. And so we see in this post-workers literature that there are kind of two responses or two ways of dealing with this. One is the free labor thesis, where you claim that, well, but these workers, they don't only provide a service. In the case of Uber, they drive people around, but they also produce data. For Uber, more interesting than the actual service of driving people around is the data that they gather through their platform. That's where they make their actual money. And so the claim is then, well, but these workers are providing this data for free. So they are being exploited in that this data is being expropriated from them and they don't get anything in return. This, for the Marxists in the room, this sounds a lot like the traditional labor theory of value that you find in Marxist Capital, where you have workers producing commodities. Those commodities are sold at a profit, but that profit doesn't all go back to the worker who has generated that value. No, they only get a wage, and there is a certain sense of surplus value that is hoarded by the capitalist. And so here it sounds a bit similar. There is labor, then rather than a commodity, data is being produced. This data is then sold at a profit, but all of this profit, all of this money goes to Uber. Now, I argue in the book, I argue against that thesis. Why? Because most of these platform companies don't actually sell their data. So, for instance, Uber doesn't do that. They don't sell the data. And they keep it for themselves, and they use that data to optimize or to monitor and surveil their own workers. That's what they use this data for. Also, if you would actually calculate for how much money these workers would be exploited, then the results might be rather disappointing. So there was, for instance, a case where some researchers calculated the rate of exploitation for Facebook. So Facebook users as well, they produce data by sharing stories and pictures and everything on Facebook. So the question would then be, for how much are they being exploited? And so they calculated this on the basis of Facebook's profit numbers. And it turned out that per Facebook user, they were exploited for 70 cents of a dollar per year. Of course, if you would tell people, well, by using Facebook, you are being exploited for 70 cents a year, I wouldn't be surprised if quite a lot of Facebook users would be absolutely fine with that. And that they would be fine with having a platform like Facebook at their disposal for 70 cents a year. And so if we're looking at it from this free labor thesis, the case might not be very convincing for exploitation. But there is another way of thinking about it, what we call the becoming rent of profit. So rather than claiming Uber exploits labor, we're saying no, Uber gets his profits from extracting rent, which basically means that they try to own things that other people want to have access to, and so they can ask an entrance fee. If we compare again to Facebook, Facebook rarely sells its data, but it uses its data to offer personalized or targeted advertisements. And then you have other companies that want access to these particular consumers, these profiled consumers. And to get that access, they have to pay Facebook a fee. It's a bit like in a shopping mall where the particular businesses have to pay the owner of the shopping mall a particular amount of money in order to show their products to people who pass by. And the owner of the shopping mall can guarantee that at least there will be people interested in buying these kinds of products. So Facebook operates a bit like a shopping mall. And Uber does as well, in that they try to gather data about people's transportation habits. So you try to know when are people moving from which part of the city to another part of the city, etc. And then you can use this data, for instance, again, for targeted advertisement. So, for instance, Pepsi and Uber at one point had an agreement where Pepsi could use Uber's platform to target specific consumers through its platform. And so what Uber then tries to do is to datafy all of our transportation habits so that it can optimize this, for instance, its targeted advertisements. And from that, it can extract rent. And so there are two forms of this rent. One is enclave rent, which basically means that Uber builds an enclave, a kind of, let's say, privately owned space for itself, to which then people again and again need to buy entrance tickets to. So, for instance, Uber amasses data about people's driving habits, such that it can invest in self-driving cars. And once it has self-driving cars, then people will have to pay to use the software on these cars and to get around. And so now this is a skill most of us have, as it were, in our own bodies and being able to drive. And what they're trying to do is, as it were, extract the skill from human beings, put it into a platform, and then ask us money to access it. Or another form of rent, financial rent. They use their data assets as leverage to attract money from investors. Saying, well, but with these data assets, we can deliver huge profits in the future. So venture capitalists or financial capitalists invest in us now. And that's how they stay afloat. Because in the case of Uber specifically, it's quite interesting to note that the company has actually never been profitable yet. So as of now, for the last almost 15 years, Uber has only survived on the money coming from investors. It never has actually made any profits. Okay, I'm gonna move a bit more quickly here to get through my argument, but second case here is an alienation, where I look specifically at digital reputation systems. So basically you as a consumer of, for instance, Airbnb, after your stay, you are asked to rate the services offered by your host. And the reason for that is because this can generate trust among strangers. And you need to pay in advance for your particular Airbnb lodging that you're staying at. And so you want to know that the person at the other side of the transaction is trustworthy. And so how do you do that? Well, by looking at their digital reputation. Have other people in the past have been happy about this person? So the problem there is that eventually hosts note that they have to adapt their behavior to fit into whatever's being measured by the digital reputation system. So for instance, once it starts measuring things like cleanliness, so if it asks guests to rate their hosts on cleanliness, you see that hosts have to respond by cleaning their lodging again and again and again in order to make sure that they don't get downgraded. Because eventually their lodging will appear in the search engine of Airbnb on the basis of their digital reputation. So the better their reputation, the higher up they are. And as you probably know from experience, when going online, usually when you look something up through a search engine, you only look at the first page of results. And so for hosts as well, it's very important to be on this first page. This means the difference between getting a lot of income and getting no income at all. So eventually you notice that they will try to please their customer in whatever way they can in order to get this digital reputation. And eventually this leads to forms of alienation, where even literally Airbnb hosts comment saying things like, I feel like a stranger in my own home. Then thirdly, another obstacle to worker autonomy is fatigue, by which I mean that our labor power, our human energy, is being depleted at a faster rate than it is able to regenerate itself. And Marx himself also thought about labor power in this sense, specifically in the first volume of Capital, where he links up this notion of labor power with thermodynamics from physics. At the moment, this was a theory that was on the rise in Germany, and Marx was using the concept of labor power, which he didn't invent himself, but that came from thermodynamics, to explain how workers' energy was also subject to entropy and was also subject of being depleted by capitalism. And so his claim was that workers need sustainable working conditions and need sufficient free time to reproduce their labor power in order to render their work survivable, so to speak. And so in this case, of course, he makes that claim for 19th century industrial factories, where he claims, well, these labor conditions are so horrible that workers are completely exhausted after just a few years, and eventually many of them die at a very young age due to workplace accidents, malnutrition, asbestos poisoning, etc., etc. And so these bodies are, as it were, put under so much stress that rather than living for 70, 80 years like we do now, these workers often lived only till they were 30 or 40 years old. And so quickly were these bodies depleted of energy. And so today you see something similar happening again in the gig economy, where you have lots of workplace accidents, lots of problems with burnout and depression, especially because there isn't much of an incentive for platform companies to deliver these sustainable working conditions. And whenever, for instance, a delivery courier has a road accident or traffic accident or quits, there are multitudes still in line to replace this one worker. So why would Deliveroo organize more sustainable working conditions? So even there you can see that their autonomy is being undermined by making them work harder than they are actually physically and mentally capable of doing. So these are the central chapters of the book, but I end them with the claim or with the question, how should we then improve this worker autonomy? How should we fulfill this promise of worker autonomy? And so I start then from, again, this post-workerist case where you claim, well, workers should start a revolution and own their own the digital means of production. They should expropriate these platform companies and take these platforms for themselves. And so there the question is one of ownership or a change of ownership. Rather than capitalist ownership over the means of production, and there should be working class ownership of the means of production. And so I put a couple of question marks in front of that claim. I'm not going to go through the whole argument here, but I'll start with one and the most important argument. Namely that this technology, or what these Marxists call the general intellect, or I say all this hardware and software of these platforms, that these are, politically speaking, rather ambivalent. It's not just a case of a change of ownership. That's not sufficient, because these capitalist imperatives for alienation, for fatigue, for exploitation are embedded in the technology itself. To give, for instance, an example of exploitation, it's interesting to realize that the very first versions of Facebook did not have a like button. The like button didn't exist yet. You only had posts and pictures. And in order to datafy people's interests for targeted advertisements, Facebook had to count on how long you kept something on your screen without scrolling away. Whereas, of course, that might not be enough, or at least that's not specialized information. you can get this information more specific by adding something like a like button. And then you can, as it were, privatize this information about people's interests in a more detailed or more meticulous fashion. But so the like button itself, embedded in the platform itself, is actually an imperative, or as it were, a device for exploitation. So changing the ownership of Facebook is not enough. You should also think about the technological design of the platform itself. How are you going to change these imperatives? Or another example, my digital rating or digital reputation system that I was just talking about with Airbnb. So I said there, this digital rating system encourages hosts for Airbnb to submit to the whimsical or arbitrary desires of their guests, because they need these reputations to appear high up on the search engine. So this digital reputation system actually also measures a whole bunch of other things, like host response speed. So if a guest sends a message, a question to a host, for instance, what's the password for the Wi-Fi or any of these questions, then Airbnb, through its digital reputation system, measures how fast the host responds. And the faster he responds, the higher this digital reputation will be. But of course, here again, you are, as it were, encouraging submission to or domination by this platform through the technological design of the platform itself. So changing the ownership of Airbnb, making hosts themselves owner of the platform, will not be enough. You should also start thinking about how should these hosts redesign the platform. And so these questions are not really being asked in the post-workerist tradition as of yet. And so hence, I turn to another philosopher, one who was especially popular in the 1970s, Ivan Illich, who talks about constructing convivial tools or convivial technologies. So who is this Illich? He's not a post-workerist or a workerist. He's not even a Marxist. He was originally a Catholic priest, but one who turned away from the church and eventually became, as it were, the forefather for degrowth philosophy. So for those who are interested in the degrowth movement, one of the symbols of the movement is a snail. Well, this symbol actually comes from Illich. He discusses it in his book on gender, where he claims, well, the snail is an animal that knows how to live well without fostering exponential growth. Whereas he claims that modern capitalist economies require exponential growth to survive. And he makes a similar kind of analysis for technology, where he claims, for instance, that, let's say the example of the car, where he says, well, also cars depend on infinite growth, which is eventually unsustainable, both for the earth and for ourselves, and for our own autonomy. So how does he explain with the case of the car? Well, he says, once people start owning cars, this changes our temporal expectations. So for instance, if we know that people can own cars, then we expect people to be at any place in the same country within a couple of hours. Whereas previously, with a bike or something like that, this would have been completely impossible. But so once these temporal expectations are set, they become a standard for everyone, which means that if you would like not to own a car, you are simply unable to do so. So maybe in Europe, this might be a bit more difficult to understand, but Illich was writing this from the context of the US, where indeed supermarkets, living spaces, working spaces are so far apart from each other, and public transport is at such a low state that indeed it's all practically impossible for individuals to have kind of a socially valuable life without owning a car. And so in the American context, he has a point that the car has become, that basically that everyone has become entirely dependent on this technology of cars being around. But of course, once everyone has cars and drives with these cars, the results can be quite counterproductive, because then we get stuck in traffic. And so we actually start losing time. And yet the only response seems to be, well, then we should need even more cars, and then we need to change our environment even more to facilitate the use of the car even more, or into an increasing fashion. So, for instance, these are then the claims of, well, if we get stuck in traffic, then we should build extra lanes on our highways. And in that way we can move faster again. Of course, what's the problem here is that if you add extra lanes to your highway, this will make people even more dependent on cars, meaning there will be more cars, which means that we are again stuck in traffic, etc., etc. So we can make even the same kind of claims about, for instance, our smartphones nowadays. That there as well, there are a couple of psychological tricks hidden in these smartphones that make us entirely dependent on them, so that we have to use them even more and more. And so I'm originally from Belgium, and in Belgium, this week we've been having a public debate about ATM machines and whether towns in the countryside still need ATM machines. And some people say yes, but others say no, we now have our smartphones, and people should simply learn to do their finances on their smartphones. And which is, of course, very good for all these platform companies and for companies like Apple, because we become more and more dependent on having smartphones. So these kinds of examples, or these forms of reasoning, were already articulated by Illich in the 1970s. But he's not entirely techno-pessimistic. He claims that technologies can actually enhance human autonomy as well. And these forms of technology he calls convivial tools, where he claims that convivial tools basically do three things. One, they liberate human beings from institutions that render their minds independent, dependent. And so, in other words, they foster independence. The second quality is they enhance our capacities for self-expression or for self-determination. So a technology should help us to determine our own choices and our own lives. And thirdly, once we are able to determine our own lives, we should be able to recognize ourselves in the results that we produce. We should be able to resonate with the activities in which we engage with these technologies. So one of Illich's examples, I stay in the sphere of transportation, is the bicycle, where he claims, well, bicycles make us independent from, for instance, governments deciding the schedule for public transport. We are completely independent about when or how we use our bicycle. And they enhance our capacity for self-determination, because indeed we can move faster and further away by using a bike. And it also helps us to resonate. Once we cycle a lot, we're able to, as it were, experience the open air and get physical exercise in such a way that it's actually healthy for us to move about using a bicycle. So bicycles are one of these examples of convivial tools. And you see here that indeed there isn't really this self-propelling dynamic that keeps making us dependent on bicycles. We could still go on foot rather than go and use our bicycle if we want to. It's just that the bicycle enhances opportunities rather than limiting them. And so my claim at the end of the book is, well, we should think in similar terms about digital platforms. namely about changing the design of these platforms themselves to foster mental independence, autonomous self-expression or self-determination, and resonance. And you find these similar kind of arguments a lot in the discourse or the literature about cooperative platforms. And so, for instance, there's a movement based in New York called the Platform Cooperativism Consortium. And it's managed by Trevor Scholz, who I mentioned before. He's the author of this book here, Trevor Scholz, Overworked and Underpaid. So he was one of the first to launch this idea of cooperative platforms. And so the claim is, with these cooperative platforms, we can actually enhance these three criteria. So let's look at the case of mental independence. In the book, for instance, I mentioned the case of the right to disconnect. Namely, that digital platform should allow us the opportunity to disconnect from them without punishment. Remember, for instance, the case of Airbnb I mentioned, where Airbnb measures the response rate or the response speed of hosts when guests ask them questions. This means that they can never truly disconnect from the platform, because if they miss a message, it can hurt their reputation and hence their future income. So you should stay away from these kinds of mechanisms. Or more transparent evaluation metrics in general. So for instance, there's the case here of Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is a click work platform where workers organized amongst themselves through internet forums, Facebook groups and Reddit groups, to help each other out in figuring out how the algorithm works. And also they developed a tool of their own called Turkopticon, with which they could evaluate their customers, their consumers as well. And because that was a specific thing with the reputation system of Amazon Mechanical Turk, in that consumers could rate workers, but workers could not rate consumers. And so this gave opportunities for clients to abuse their power in all kinds of ways. And so Turkopticon was a mechanism to defend worker interests. But also autonomous self-determination is important. And so, for instance, you should think about ways in which workers can participate with data experts in developing the code of their own platforms. And so Co-op Cycle is a good example of this. And so this is a federation of delivery platforms where Co-op Cycle itself dispatches data experts to particular couriers in particular European cities. And then these couriers, together with these data experts, collectively write the algorithms for their own platform in such a way that they are specifically tailored for these workers. And then the last element, resonance, and finding ways in which people can find meaning in their work, and not just a wage, but also some form of identity, where you can see again, with staying with the case of delivery couriers, that there is a possibility there for work pride, or this kind of artisanal culture that you can find among other professions as well. So community building through a kind of common identity by knowing your own profession very well and being very skilled at it. And that this is a way in which you can build resonance among these workers. And so, and cooperative platforms, because they, as it were, promote forms of participatory government, are better at fostering these forms of common identities. But of course, some of you might think now, but yeah, but if these cooperative platforms have to compete with these privately owned platforms, they will obviously be either outcompeted or they will have to resort to the same exploitative practices of these privately owned platforms. And this is the kind of classical argument of capitalist competition coming from Karl Marx himself and Rosa Luxemburg when talking about cooperatives. And so both of them claim cooperatives are not enough or insufficient to emancipate workers, because these cooperatives will have to compete with capitalist firms. But I claim that this argument doesn't really hold in the platform economy. Why? Because this is not a case of a traditional capitalist market from the very start. I told you in the case of Uber, this company isn't actually making a profit. They are, as it were, undermining the competitive conditions of free market capitalism by burning through this venture capital or this finance capital. And so they're using the money of investors to undermine traditional competition. And of course, you cannot directly compete with that, but many of these companies will probably not survive. Once, as where the bill comes to shove, and they will actually have to make profits, chances are relatively high that some of these companies will go bankrupt. And so rather than competing with them directly, or what I call synchronic competition, so competition at the same time, you should organize diachronic competition. So a competition where you don't compete directly, but you wait out until these platforms go bankrupt, and then you replace them. And so you need to be able to make sure that there are cooperative alternatives ready to replace these privately owned platforms. So one case where this did happen was in the US, in Austin, in Texas, where Uber and Lyft, due to a legal dispute, at one moment withdrew from the city, hoping that consumers would demand the return of Uber and Lyft. But instead, what happened was that the municipal government had invested in cooperative and non-profit alternatives, and so consumers quickly shifted to these cooperative alternatives. And so there you see what you need. There is a level of government investment in these alternative platforms to make sure that the course of technological development moves into this cooperative direction. So this is something that I call venture socialism. And there is some precedent for this actually in the UK itself, and namely the Lucas Plan from 1976. And so this was an investment plan set up by the workers of Lucas Aerospace Corporation, which was an aerospace company that at the moment was doing or was having a difficult time financially speaking. And so the workers decided to take over the company and to redirect its investment structure towards the production of what they call, or towards the development of what they call socially useful production. So they tried to move technological innovation towards these socially useful products. Problem was that, as you know, 1976 is just a few years before the rise of Margaret Thatcher. And so when Thatcher became Prime Minister in the UK, and this Lucas Plan was shelved to never return. But it's so about these kinds of ideas that I'm thinking about in which we can change the direction of the platform economy. So to summarize, I realize I've gone rather quickly, so don't hesitate to ask me questions later on, but kind of as a summary, I started from this broken promise of the gig economy, where we are promised entrepreneurial freedom and workplace autonomy, but instead we get subsistence entrepreneurship. We are forced to be entrepreneurs in order to survive on wages that are even below minimum wage. This comes with a couple of obstacles to worker autonomy, like exploitation, alienation, and fatigue. And so my claim is to revive this worker autonomy as conviviality, to make sure that you focus on the design of the platform technology itself, and by fostering independence, self-determination, and resilience. So with that, you've got a bit about kind of a main overview of the argument. As maybe some of you will have checked online whether to buy the book. It's rather expensive, I must admit. But with this code, you can actually get a 30% discount. So I advise you to use that.